Good evening. On behalf of the Friends of the Harriet Beecher Stowe House, we respectfully acknowledge that the ground on which we stand are traditional Miami and Shawnee lands. We extend our esteem and gratitude to the indigenous people who call this place home. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to the Harriet Beecher Stowe House online, our great folks online, and here at the Walnut Hills Williams Library. So we have kind of half and half tonight, where we have a lot of people here in the room and a few more people joining us online. My name is Christina Hartley, and I'm the director here at the Harriet Beecher Stowe House. And we welcome you to our Power of Voice discussion series. We do want to thank our Power of Voice discussion series sponsor, with School Outfitters, to learn more about your services, which include lots of great furniture for schools and offices. But visit their website at School Outfitters. All right, so tonight we are going to be talking about William, is it Apess?
There are different pronunciations.
So William Apess, and we're going to, well, like always, we will go for about an hour and 15 minutes-ish. And then we'll wrap it up and, talk about all the other great programming that we have coming up here at the Harriet Beecher Stowe House. So I'm going to turn it over to John Getz, who is our discussion leader, and he's going to get us started. I'm assuming probably with the timeline, so we're going to find that and put it up on the screen. People here in the room, we do have copies of the timeline and questions there on the check-in table. Did not grab one yet. All right, here we go. Okay, take it away, Joe.
Thanks, Chris. And this is Native American Heritage Month. We're in November, so pictures will be starting. And on the timeline, I want to look first at the things that happened before William Apess was even born, and then a couple of wars. And the first of those was the Pequot War from 1636 to 1638, in which massacres by the Puritans and their native allies in the war reduced the population of the Pequots from 3,000 to about 200. Most of whom are sold into slavery in New England. Slavery, yes, there was one this time before the West Indies. Few escaped or joined other tribes. Treaty of Hartford ended the war and outlawed the Pequot language and name. Now that's a pretty dramatic thing, and suggests an attempt at genocide, really, ethnic cleansing of these people, this tribe. You're not allowed to speak the language or even unify yourself as a Pequot. They seized the tribal lands and disbanded the survivors. But as is true for Native Americans in general, he didn't go away. In fact, survivors and descendants of those survivors, that they were able to get, perhaps feeling some guilt over what had happened, to establish a reservation for them at next in Tucker. And then another reservation followed in 1683. So just about 30 years after the war, there was a reservation for the survivors. They weren't generally known, however. Most people thought the tribe had become completely extinct, disbanded. And so it came as a surprise to a lot of people as they began to study history, to learn that the Pequots had survived. King Phillip, also just a little perspective going on in England at this time. In the 1640s, there was a civil war going on in England between the Puritans, the same group who were here in New England, and the Royalists. There was a brutal civil war. 50,000 Royalists lost their lives, and about 34,000 parliamentarians died. So it was a brutal age. on both sides of the Atlantic. And the king, Madam King, in 1649, Rose the First. So, we're a tough folk. By 1675, let's skip ahead to King Philip's War, which met the comet. We took the name King Philip as sort of a gesture toward the British, conciliation toward the British settlers, and also just because it marked a new phase in his life, interacting with the colonists. His name, or at least that's what it came down to us as. Humetakam is really a more authentic name for him. If you start reading more of the history of this period, you find out that a lot of the names we had for Native American figures at this time were highly anglicized names. They're what the colonists thought their names were, but necessarily what they were really. So Humetakam used the best name for him. And he was the sachem or a chief of the Wampanoag Confederacy against the New England Confederation and their native allies. Violence occurred. It was a brutal war. About 2,000 dead in battle of the Native Americans, and more than 3,000 died from sickness or starvation. As many as 1,000 captives may have been sold into slavery in the West Indies. And there were plenty of sides, and a lot of colonists were killed as well. Villages were burned. He was, and then they were sold to slavery in Bermuda in many cases. And there are people today living in Bermuda who claim descent from King Philip, Metacomet, because his son and his wife were sold into slavery after he was killed. And they claim descent through his son. He was shot to death. His corpse was beheaded, then drawn and quartered. His head was displayed on a spike in Plymouth for a generation. It remained aboard right on for more than 2 years. If you were with us last month, by John Goodman Brown, this is the war, Philip's War, in which their great-great-great-grandfather helped to burn the name of Philip. Philip's War, and that's the father of the fictional Goodman Brown story. As far as who's really responsible for these wars, historians of the Pequot War generally say that the British fabricated causes for the war in order to get at ports and trading routes. Pequot occupied, and as far as King Philip's War, even at the time, Rhode Island, which suffered during King Philip's War, even the people in Rhode Island sent a letter after the war blaming the United Colonies of New England for provoking the Narragansetts into the war. So even at the time, there was remorse and recrimination against aggressive colonists. Okay. So that's some background that you need to understand these pieces. William Apess was born in Massachusetts. Mixed background. His father has white and Native American parents, but identified strongly as Pequot. His wife, Candace Apess, who may not be William's biological mother. There's questions about that. So he claimed to be his mother, mixed Native American and African American ancestry, and was enslaved at some point. But she too identifies as Pequot. They don't have much money, they struggle, they move a lot, and they wind up separating just a few years after he's born. So he's living with his grandparents, suffers a severe beating from his grandmother, had alcohol issues. She was out on a binge, came back, beat him very horribly, so badly that the community indentured him to another family. And he stays with them for 7 years and attends the winter school for 6 years. So in that respect, he was very fortunate, unusual maybe for some education, and he made the most of it. He didn't have any education, but obviously quite widely, owns his own writing skills. Uh, by 1813, he converts to Methodist. He undergoes a conversion experience, enlists as a drummer boy in the militia in New York, and winds up seeing action in the War of 1812. He fights in the Battle of Plattsburgh, but not as a drummer. Turned out he enlisted as a drummer boy, but wound up in battle. And was part of a key victory for the U.S. in the War of 1812. Winds up going further with the Methodist faith, gets baptized, and now becomes, by the late 1820s, an exhorter, an itinerant preacher, often preaching to groups of Native Americans. He's ordained a minister by the Protestant Methodist Church. There were two branches of the Methodist Church at that time, and one rejected it. The more high-tone rejected it, but the Protestant Methodist Church took him. They rejected the original group, rejected him because he was Native American. That same year, he writes and publishes his autobiography, Son of the Forest, which, if you have this book, or you could easily track it down and click online. It's not a very long autobiography, but you might find it interesting if you're interested in this figure. Considering that, 1829, same year, here comes Harriet Beecher and her sister Catherine writing letters on behalf of the Cherokee Nation, keeping its ancestral land. So the whole series of events that would lead to the trail appears by the late 1830s, 10 years later. It's underway now by the late 1820s. And by 1830, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, allowing President Andrew Jackson to relocate Eastern Native Americans west of the Mississippi. And this leads by the end of that decade to the Trail of Tears. Meanwhile, he's preaching. He's in Boston in the early 1830s. William Lloyd Garrison's there, publishing The Liberator. He publishes some of Apess's sermons, which always often had a social point to them, and praised his talents and piety. So he's associating with abolitionists at this time. At one point, Frederick Douglass was supposed to make a speech a little bit later and couldn't make it, and he was still in for it. So he was traveling in the circle of abolitionists. 1833, this is a key event. It's like a key event in Native American history. He goes to Mashpee, Massachusetts, and leads the Mashpee Revolt, which sounds very violent, but it wasn't at all. It was a nonviolent civil disobedience campaign, tribal rights for the Mashpee. He serves 30 days in jail and winds up agrees to pay a $100 fine for disturbing the peace. He didn't want to be violent at all. Problem was that settlers were coming over and chopping down wood on the Native American land. And so they organized a civil action where they would go out and unload the wagons. That's all they did. And got him thrown in jail. And some of you might be thinking, Henry David Thoreau. Well, there is a tantalizing possibility. Thoreau is at Harvard at this time, in college, and he did travel to Mashpee. And he, of course, wrote about, by 1849, so that was dead, Thoreau was writing Resistance to Civil Government about his time in jail. And he stayed, that same year, he stayed at a hotel in Mashpee that was owned by the brother, one of the first selectmen appointed when Mashpee won. So there may be a connection. We don't have direct evidence, but a lot of things we could point at Thoreau maybe having influenced by him. He published the experiences of 5 Christian nations, also in 1833. By the way, the Mashpee Revolt was reported as a violent. So. Seemed violent. So. He published the experiences of 5 Christian Indians, or an Indian's looking glass for the white man, which was the final essay in that collection. And the next year, that was in 33, the next year in 1834, the Mashpee won their case. They were awarded their own township and allowed them to elect their own people, and they had a space for themselves. Very unusual that the American courts were favorable to Native American claims at that time.
Was it a federal court?
I think it was a Massachusetts court. I don't think it went to the Supreme Court. I think it was a local or statewide. I think he so he published that, and yeah, his account of that is the nullification in 1835, and the second in 1836 is a eulogy on King Phillip in Boston. A few weeks later, Byron, somebody wanted to hear it. I think it was a shorter version, but he did repeat it and publish. And interestingly, by the next year, we're seeing some of the self-fashioning going on. And many of these writers have changed their names or altered their names a little bit. Hawthorne, Nathaniel Haythorne became Nathaniel Hawthorne, probably just to distinguish himself from his ancestors at the witch trials and burning villages in King Philip's War. And so he adds an extra S to the end of his name. Nobody knows quite why that one. Although, my guess, but it would be a guess, is that he didn't like people maybe saying his name Ames. With theological pronunciation. So by the late 30s, it's the Trail and Tears, 1839. Now, if you read this book and read the headnote on King Philip, it says that he kind of disappeared after giving the essay on King Philip a couple of times. But that turns out not to be true. Later research, this was in the 1990s, Mary O'Connell writing this, a big service to get this stuff back into print. But later research has found that he was giving this talk all around the Northeast for the last couple of years of his life. New York, Boston, he was on the same lecture circuit that a lot of the abolitionists were. And finding a similar audience. Sadly, he died very suddenly in 1839. A lot of debate as to why. The best guess I've heard is a ruptured appendix. In 1986, here come the Pequods again. They get a casino. Turns out to be a very successful casino. 1986, they're reconstituted Mashantucket, Western Pequot tribe, owns a casino, and then in the 1990s, this book comes out, Barry O'Connell, where he begins the revival of interest in Apess. Nobody was reading him before that. Dropped out of sight after he died. His work dropped out of sight. I didn't graduate school. Getting a PhD in 19th century American over one. Or he might have been a footnote someplace, but reading his work was not something there. And he didn't come back into the scholarly public eye until the 1990s with O'Connell's edition of his book. So it showed what a difference a scholar's voice can make. How much power that can provide. And since there's been a lot of critical done. There's one source I want to recommend to you here, and that's a YouTube video. Tired of reading, well, you can watch a very good scholar, Drew Openzina. And then there are a couple of YouTube videos that he did on Apess. and some of my material comes from there, but it's more just the idea of learning about this guy and seeing what he has meant to so many people over the years since his work came back in print. So I recommend either of the YouTube videos by Open Video.
Just out of curiosity, where did this scholar find his writings? I mean, who preserved them? Do you know?
No, I don't. It's a very good question. I don't know the story of
I'm just, one of those.
discovering. Piece of the book exists. The
Mhm.
original publication.
Mhm.
I've seen photo copying. I probably ran across one of those while doing archival
Right.
research in a library.
Do you have any descendants?
Let's see.
No.
A couple of, I think no, I don't think so. I'm not aware of any children if they have. Could be wrong about that. You know, very wise. No one knows exactly what. It shows up. What? Don't talk about Kevin. So.
Looks like Dan has a question or comment.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions that on this reading and some other readings I've been doing that happen to be peripheral to this. First thing is that he became a Methodist minister in the 1830s, and reading both of his speeches, they're tremendously angry at Christians, and rightfully so. I mean, that's the history that he presents, but it puzzles me why he became a Christian. That puzzles me. And peripheral to that is I happen to have visited the Mashpee reservation in 2 years ago, was it? During their powwow that they had. It's a very small reservation in the little city of Mashpee, which is in Cape Cod. And since it was their powwow and their celebration, their chief gave a talk about how wonderful they all were. And he was extremely Christian and praising Christ the whole time. And that I find unusual too. The Mashpee now are really, really strong Christians. He is a Christian, but he talks about all of the stuff that the Christians have done to in particular, the Mashpees. So I'm confused by that. So that's my first question. I have another one that's peripheral to that too. So I'm going to go on with the second question, if that's okay. I happen to be reading peripheral to this and no connection whatsoever until I see this connection. I'm reading John Woolman journal. He's a Quaker in the 1770s. And he also addresses the slavery that occurs with the Indians and the slavery that's occurring with Africans that are imported. But he never says in his what they're doing. What industry are they doing? I've always focused on slavery as being a Southern problem. I never focused it on being a problem in the Pacific. I mean, in the Northeast. But obviously, Quakers own lots. Quakers of all people own lots of slaves in the 1770s, and also they enslaved Indians. But it's never focused on what industry did they do. They picked cotton, and they were in the agricultural business in the South. I'm not sure what they did at that time in the Northeast. So those are my two puzzles that I have that I don't quite understand with my readings.
There were farm laborers for the most part.
In New York City.
Yeah, I think they did a little, they were, domestics,
Yeah.
you know,
That,
same, basically the same thing, yeah,
Sojourner.
yeah.
yeah, hard.
Yeah.
So, this is the big issue in the Northeast. In the earlier times, yeah.
Right.
Even Sojourner Truth, the 19th century. Um, so I think farm laborers, domestic servants, things like that, and some of the people, some of the Native Americans who were losers in these wars were given to people in the Northeast.
Slave ship, didn't, one of the slave ships like landed right by New York City or in that area.
Well, in the early.
Yeah.
Till the international.
Right.
until the US took a stand against.
Right, but before that, in the 1600s.
Early.
Are there any indications that the Puritans tried version? The Native Americans, that's some Moravians. See,
Yes, there was, it's a minority. There was a guy named John Elliott, who was called the Apostle of the Indians. And he went out and lived with Native Americans, tried to translate the Bible to their languages. He was really interested in conversions in a much more English spirit. But the majority of them did not have interest in doing that at all. They wanted to clear people out. And they came to the US to North America, looking for religious freedom for themselves, but not for anybody else. So, thankfully, Elliott's position was very unusual among the Puritans, but that is an example.
There was, I recently read this book that we're considering for a book club next year, but that talks about the doctrine of discovery, that there were Christian sects, large Christian sects that believed in this doctrine of discovery that was decreed in 1500s, around there, that basically said, if you went to a place that was not Christian, it didn't matter who was there, your Christianity trumped everything. That's a short and sweet way, short and ugly way to say it, I guess, but much more complicated than that. But that was basically the idea was, if you went, and the Indians, obviously, the Native Americans obviously weren't Christian, so taking their land and killing them, burning their villages was considered to be, a Christian thing to do. It goes back to what Dan was saying, doesn't compute for me that you can say you're a believer in Christ and believe these things, but it
Right.
happens.
If I could interject for just a minute, that was in the late 1400s when it was a papal decree. It was a Catholic Church, a Pope's decree. The doctrine of discovery is a Pope's decree. So and it still has found legal tender, in this century. So yeah, it was a papal decree.
Thanks, Dan. I'm one of those people, I read the book and 10 minutes later, I forget what I've read, so.
I want to get back to Ken's first question.
Yes.
It's really important one, I think.
Go ahead.
How do you reconcile Apess as a Methodist minister? How does he reconcile his Christianity with the horrible treatment that the missionaries gave to the Native Americans, which he condemned? How do you resolve that? A better question than any of the ones I came.
It's the best of the terrible options. I mean, he doesn't have, right, at the time he's born, there aren't that many, we call them Pequot left anyway. So any Native American traditions, spiritual or otherwise, that you might have been able to rely on had they been a normal functioning society, probably weren't there. Now, Native Americans, my understanding, this is a gross generalization, so I'm sorry, do tend to place a lot of importance in spiritualism. And so therefore, things that I've read, limited, suggest that they are happy to adopt Christianity because it does reconcile, that the concept of Christianity reconciles nicely with their general value system. And that they are part of his rebuke of the treatment in these things isn't a rebuke of Christianity per se, it's a rebuke of people calling themselves Christian. And so that, you know, it is easy if you want to be spiritual and to identify with a God. And in this case, he's like, well, you call it Jesus, so let's go with that. You know, that's fine, you know, but I think you are misinterpreting how you would, you know, manage or otherwise interact with us. It's an oversimplified view.
And I think that's a key distinction, and it's a distinction he makes consistently, and so does Frederick Douglass, who doesn't condemn Christianity. He condemns what he considers false Christianity, a misrepresentation, a misunderstanding of the Bible. Is there. So, and I think that's the answer to your question, really, Dan, that Apess believes that the message of Christianity is love and embracing your fellow humans. And he condemns the missionary, not because they're Christian, but because they're not Christian.
Well, in the first reading that when we did, I mean, he's definitely, you know, goes, you know, quotes multiple Bible verses and says, are you really doing this? I don't think you are. So that's, you know, that's the thing. He's calling them to repent, to follow the real Christianity.
Which is an old tradition. If you read the Hebrew Bible, Jeremiah, the sermon of you're way out of line, you're out of line. That's the community who says you believe in God, you better repent, you better get your act together. So he's kind of coming out with
And that continues to today.
Yep.
Every day.
Yeah.
So it was a purist. Would you say that? Because it doesn't have the political stoppings. He doesn't have the he didn't bring socio-cultural stuff along with him that they brought from England. So he's looking at it from more of a purist tradition. I think it's in the second piece, the longer piece, where he says, hello, people, did you look at Jesus? What color was he? You see what color he was? You know, the white versus, the other color of skin, just that's what it is.
Someone online was about to say something. So if you're online and you can find a way to jump in, go right ahead. And if you want to say something and you can't find a way to jump in, just do the virtual hand raise and I will call on you. Go ahead, Vicky. Unmute yourself and say something. Uh-oh, Vicky?
I see I was muted. Maybe one of the things that drew him and other African Americans to Christianity was they saw it as liberation theology also. As you think about the spirituals with Moses, let my people go, and there was that was, I think, that helped to draw them to Christianity.
Yeah, thank you. Vanessa? Go ahead and unmute.
Hello. I was thinking too that the assumption sometimes is that Native people did not have a spiritual connection in life. And so the understanding of Christianity gets a bit of a Native twist. which is sometimes not understood by colonizing people. So what is called a Christian may, that is the name that the colonizers give the name, but Native people may not have necessarily crossed into that same understanding the same exact way. And sometimes they withheld that. Van Delorean talks about that a lot in understanding Native perspective. It's very clear. The other comment that was made about enslavement in the North and Northeast, people were enslaved for labor. So that meant they cleared land. They were used for clearing land, not only crop, but also building walls, and so on and so forth. So it wasn't just domesticity, but it was the actual clearing of land, having the ability to build the structures that people were maintaining, as well as being traded for the rum, sugar, and tobacco that was also being used. So they were a commodity as well, not just for a labor force. Thanks.
Thank you.
Helen, it looks like you put something in the chat about the Trail of Tears book and recommending that. Do you want to say something else too?
Yeah, are you able to hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, okay, good. First of all, thank you for the discussion. I really appreciate this. This is the first one that I've sat in on. I've been doing this since January, but I finally got to your November meeting. But I wanted to let you know that if anyone who hadn't read Trail of Tears, which I had not, the audio company chirpsbooks.com has it for $3.99. They said it was originally $29. I don't know about that, but I was able to pick that up. I was also glad to hear a little bit of the background about this gentleman, because one of the readings when he talked about rum as a fiery curse, and now I can understand his disdain for it, since I'm understanding that his grandmother had problems with alcoholism and then beat him. So it made me understand why he is so against rum. But once again, thank you all. I really appreciate the discussion.
Thank you. Always like to put things into context. One of my favorite words.
And somebody had a comment where I can't read it.
Oh, that was Helen talking about the Trail of Tears.
Well, let's get to some of the questions. First one was, what surprised or enlightened you as you read? Is there anything anybody wants to talk about under that heading? We haven't already talked.
Possibly just slightly elaborate on Joanne's comment. As someone that went to Catholic grade school, Catholic high school, and then finally arrived at a Jesuit college, it wasn't until I got to college that the concept that Jesus may not have been white was introduced. And I've always found that odd, me personally, and to see that it was written by someone now a couple hundred years ago. So the concept was neither new nor foreign. It's just not discussed at all, Most of the people that I was going to church with and to school with and stuff like that. It's always bothered me. And I was both thrilled and dismayed to read it here. That's why I read the whole thing twice. The other thing, because I'm like, surely it can't be, because he says it both places, and repeats it and backs up the why. And it's like you can't, and he uses it so he's so articulate with I don't know where he gets his numbers, 15 out of 16 people not being white in the world kind of thing, but he sure says it like he knows it. So, like I said, I enjoyed reading it because I've always wondered why this doesn't get more play. And that's not a question for the group, that's just my thing. So that's what struck me. I appreciated reading that in this particular.
And to your point, I think he has an unusual ability for the time to identify with people of color around.
Yes.
Not just in the U.S., not just enslaved people in the U.S., Native Americans. So I think he has this wider sense of, that he must have got through his reading.
I guess reading, right? If he only went to school for 6 months, he must have picked it up.
Well, he had 6 terms.
6 years. Oh,
6 winter. Like one. On the farm, but, we're able to move full during the.
And, I'm surprised at how well spoken he was, what an excellent he apparently was, and, he has a gift for argument, the ability to, you know, put out this side and that side, or, you know, as I related to you, blah, blah, you know, the way that he presents, his points, and basically, I mean, sometimes he goes casting, but does a great job of it, and it comes through on the page, so I can imagine trying to hear him showing this in person and being fascinating, captivating. And another point though, you know, yes, he is a native, you know, he's looking at this from the Native American and the African American perspective. He's still looking at it from the and throughout the entire thing, the reference is to men this, men that. There is not, except for his acknowledgement at some point of his stellar wife, and I forget the verbiage was.
Do you think it's a generic name? Don't you think that's just generic, like people instead of saying
Generic, that's part of the whole problem. Well, it's the same reason that you pointed out Jesus Christ thing. Gee, why do you think that is? Do you think it has something to do with all the white men that have been running? Absolutely. And excluded, you know, even, I have the unusual, experience of being the PR director for missionaries for 3.5 years. It was obnoxious. And it was one of the reasons I ended up deciding it was time for me to move on. Because even when the missionaries or the bishops, for example, in Africa might be African American, but the hierarchy was there. They were less than the white bishops, wherever they might be, anywhere, and ultimately, you know, I found that as someone that had how many years of education at that point, probably 18, it was an uncomfortable situation as a woman. He tried to be a leader in that situation. And having to write articles about missionaries and what they're doing to, you know, save people and give them food and give them money and educate them in exchange for which you will believe. You know, that's pretty. It's he's got the same thing back, 300 years ago. Yeah. It's changed. It has.
You just keep repeating it.
Second question. How do you think the title in Indian Looking Glass for the White Man fits his message in that essay?
Well, we kind of talked about that, you know, like I said, when he goes through and quotes all these biblical passages and basically says, look at yourself, you know, he doesn't say look at yourself in the mirror, but that's basically what he's saying is, you know, look at yourself and see if you, you know, can stand up to this standard. And obviously he believes they can't.
But even in addition to that, I think it's also the idea of, he's talking about the past, but he's also like projecting, so look at yourself and what you're doing now in this context of the, 1830s, and are these same things still going on? He's nodding yes, just with a different group of people.
That's a key connection. And the other thing about that will be error. And so while it floods you, it also reverses some things, like writing down your third. Right here. And so I think that kind of is a key to his ironic method, through that you're talking about being sarcastic. Yeah, I think irony is a big part of it. Here we are, the savages, and here are these wonderful Christians over here. And you can imagine him presenting that. And I think it comes through quite well, even in the writing.
When I was reading this, I kept thinking of Michael Jackson. The song Man in the Mirror. I'm starting with the man in the mirror and I'm asking him to change his ways. And I thought, I wonder if, from a literary standpoint, that metaphor of person in the mirror, person looking glass, is there a history of it? Are you aware of anything?
Think about stories where people look at mirrors, but won't know a consistent line about.
Can you think of any stories where they look in the mirrors and good thing?
And what happened?
It's a good thing.
Well, generally not. Let's look at the third one. I think this is a really important one for us. Why do you think he chose the eulogy as being Phillip, who met the 60th anniversary of his death? And what I'm asking about is the context again that he was present for it. What was the mindset of Americans in admitting?
Wait,
What did you say? Alex?
wait, can you bring Lincoln?
Mm-hmm.
Wait, can you bring
Great Awakening, but it's also the time period in between the passage of the Indian Removal Act and the Trail of Tears. So that's, it's like it's coming. And really, and that also has the huge tie-in to enslavement, because it's because of the Indian Removal Act in 1830 and the pushing of all of the Native Americans west that basically opens up Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi for cotton plantations, which then exasperates the internal slave trade. And so the idea of Indian removal and increased enslavement are very closely linked, even though we don't think about them as linked. It's, in school, we talk about the Trail of Tears, and then we talk about the buildup to the Civil War, but there's not the direct connection, which actually was a direct connection.
Think about the Americans at that time. Who were the heroes? George Washington.
Andrew Jackson.
Andrew Jackson was dressed. And why was he a hero? At that point.
Killed Indians.
He was a populist, and he was known, main claim to fame originally was that they quote Indian. And he had a long history of that. So he's the president. And of course, he's committed to Indian removal. But he was as a commander of a Tennessee militia, he mobilized a force against the Creek tribe, the Creek War of 1813 to 14. Won the decisive battle in that war, got the Creeks to surrender vast parts of Alabama and Georgia. He also, by the way, won the battle. But he commanded U.S. forces after that in the first Seminole, 1817 to 1818, which led to the annexation of Florida from Spain, and he served as Florida's first territorial governor. So he's got a good history.
Go ahead, Vanessa.
Yeah.
I was gonna make the comment regarding Indian Removal Act. Indian removal starts before the act. The tribes had already been infiltrated and broken apart, and there was a split in the tribes because with Indian removal, you have part of the tribe moving on to Indian territory here in Oklahoma, because I'm in Oklahoma. And then you have the remaining factions staying on their homelands. And because those South and Southeast tribes practice the institution of enslavement of African peoples, they take some of those peoples with them here to Indian territory. So they not only disrupt a little bit of what the South is as far as land goes and slave labor, they take their labor force with them that they had been enslaving, if that makes any sense. And they have huge swatches of land, of course, in the Georgia, Alabama, Florida area, Kentucky, Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, Louisiana, and so on. And so once that land is vacated, then you have room for more white settlement coming in, because that's what, of course, Benjamin Franklin was talking about, was come to the United States for this white settlement and the clearing of this land, if that makes any sense to what we were just talking about.
Yeah.
So I think that, I'm sorry.
Go on, Vanessa.
No, go ahead. No, I was just going to say, so the what was happening around his writings was happening in a visceral way to him, of course, and what he was referring back to the past, but also current, and then seeing what's ahead, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
And I will be quiet.
It plays into the American myth at the time that this was an empty country, ready to be settled by all the Europeans coming over. That we're, just virgin territory. Fill it in, come settle. And of course, that was fewer people were there because they were getting moved off, they were getting killed or forced away.
Yeah. And of course, the people who were still in across the pond had no way of knowing what was here for them to see and for them to encounter. They had no way of knowing anything about what was here. They're just going on all the advertisement that's going on back home to come west.
What strikes me is, again, I tend to sometimes reflect the way things are now on then, and that's as far as news and information. Think of how fragmented the entire distribution of news and reporting, if there was reporting, was. But even with Harry, any communication was done by letter, and it would be 2, 3, 4 weeks before something happened or got to someone else. And in the meanwhile, look at how things could have changed within that 2 to 4 week period. So it's interesting that we've got all these eruptions and disruptions of the Indian way of life and of the families and of that whole civilization. And I don't know how many people at the time could put that all together to realize how extensive it was, and even have an awareness. I mean, how many tribes were there? I mean, I'm still hearing names of tribes that I had never heard of before. And back then, I mean, it just blows my mind to think that, you know, Harriet was working against the Cherokee, or on behalf of the Cherokees. What about it? You know, the others didn't even know. And if Harriet didn't know, and she is echelon, well-educated, has more access to outlets and to information on a more formal or informal basis than the everyday person is totally out of the loop.
How easy it would be to put, you know, that fake news that the country's empty out there, you know.
Well, and
To say, there's nobody here, come, there's all this empty land, and they don't have any way, of checking that, of knowing that.
And they're hearing about Andrew Jackson, the great Indian fighter,
Right.
and that again, you know, it's that superimposition of the power and the influence of that presidential power, which we see happening in our own society. And that's the story they got. You know, like, that's a good thing. You know, that's a good thing. We're fighting those darn Indians.
Because they're all violent. Goes back to what John said about the original, you know, that this revolt was not violent, but it was reported as violent because they had to be violent because they were Native Americans. You know, they weren't Christians. Savage, yeah.
And that, a lot of that goes back to the Puritans with their identification with the Israelites, the Old Testament coming into the promised land with their idea of that they are the chosen people of God, the elect, who are here, and everybody who's not part of us is the damned, the reprobate. And those Indians are just heathen savages, to be moved out of the way.
And
The other there.
We're still fighting that, the other.
I don't know what's involved, and I've bet that's been going on since forever.
And it plays into this idea of American exceptionalism. We still hear all the time in political speeches that we're sort of different from everybody else, completely, you know, unique. And there are certain, you know, we're a more multicultural country than a lot of countries, but so the city on the hill, which is the metaphor that Ronald Reagan quoted all the time, are we Puritans? And it also, so they're the religious roots. And so the whole history of the 18th century, the Enlightenment with its belief in progress, and that time changes, times change, civilizations rise and fall. And, you know, maybe the Native Americans were here and had their day, and now it's time for the Europeans to come over and populate.
Go back to the 3rd century and the conquering of the Teutonic tribes, and what Christianity did, and they're just getting together.
Getting back to what Victoria was saying, is that her name?
Vanessa.
Vanessa. I just realized a couple years ago that not all the native tribes went on the Trail of Tears. Did some of them hide, or didn't they not all have to go?
What tribes are you talking about? Because there are
from Georgia and
well, all of the peoples did not go. All of the tribes split. There are different factions of the tribes that stayed in their homeland. They had a choice, so to speak, of if they left, they would get paid so much for the land that they were going to. But if they stayed, they would only be allowed to have XYZ land. They wouldn't be able to take over, say they wouldn't be able to take over my grandfather and grandmother's land that they left. They would only be able to have what lands that the United States government ceded to them. That was it. So, and you left fraction of the family behind, only on a small part of the land. You didn't get to take in the extra land, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense because, you know, it's, there's, still, you know, even in Ohio, there's thriving tribes still and in Georgia, and I never really understood that. So that does make sense.
Yeah, Oklahoma is home to 39 federally recognized tribes, coming from at least over 30 of those tribes came during Indian removal.
Does this apply to all tribes or primarily the Cherokee or individual tribes? What about the Shawnees families?
Yeah, we have Shawnee here as well. Potawatomi, Ute, Missouri. We have Chickasaw, Cherokee, Creek, Muskogee, my people. And then we also have Seminole. So we have 39 federally recognized tribes. And so we have to always remember that the tribes were under, those nations of peoples were under treaty agreements with the United States government. And so it was by treaty, if we want to, you know, say that, that they were removed. And some of them that fought vehemently to stay in their homelands and on their homelands, what you find is that the numbers began to dwindle so much that you just don't have an armed force able to withstand what the United States government continued to push on the tribes. If that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
And some of the Cherokee who remain behind were particularly sensitive to freedom-seeking African Americans. In Toni Morrison's novel Beloved, Paul Lee shelters for a while with Cherokee.
So I'll just say this, that the five known as the five civilized tribes, which are the Cherokee Nation, the Chickasaw Nation, Choctaw Nation, Seminole, and Muskogee Creek, my tribe, they all practice the institution of enslavement. So what that means, and why, of course, we know why they were called civilized, was because they adopted and adapted to a colonizer's way of living, meaning religion, education, agricultural style. And just like you have with any people, some people know it's not a good thing to try to own other people, and some people say, okay, this is the way we're going to go. And so, yeah, you have different people, not all of the people, but different families did practice enslaving African peoples because that was the way of the land. Since agricultural ways were being pushed on them, the way to maintain and survive was to do that same thing that colonizers had done. The Cherokee, I'll also note that the Cherokee Nation was a mixed tribe of people by the time Harriet Beecher Stowe is born into the picture, meaning that they had already mixed with the Scotch-Irish or French. So when you have that mixture of let's say of European ancestry, then as more Europeans are coming over here, the adaptable way is the survivor, what do they call survivorance, that Native people practice the practice of not survival, but survivorance. So it was how you survive is everything. And once these tribes are mixed, then of course you have to decide, are you going to go this way or are you going to go that way? And the Cherokee Nation is known as a nation that was more open to the white man's ways. And so does that mean that their bloodline had been mixed so much so that Native way was kind of bred out of them to a certain degree, because you have some very white looking Native people in the Cherokee Nation even today. That's just understanding how strategies work in war and how infiltration is used, infiltration of families. That's practiced here in the United States as well as on the continent too. That's how you get some British soldiers that are able to move within those tribes on the continent, is they have actually married into the continent and have two families, one in England and one among those tribal nations, knowing that the two families will never meet. So always have a duality of existence. That's, the throes of war. I'm sorry to take up so much of your time.
Yes, we one reader.
Well, she mentioned it's survivance, so let's talk about that. Before scholar Gerald, who was a Native American, Gerald Visner, introduced the term survivance, which has become important in Native American studies. His definition is survivance is an active sense of presence, continuance of Native story, not mere reaction or a survivable need. Native survivance stories are renunciations of dominance, tragedy, and victimry. In other words, we're not
Right.
we're not tragic figures, vanishing figures looking sadly out over the landscape. Cherokee descent poet Diane Glancy had survivance, sur, meaning above, a survival outside or beyond survival, and vivance, vitality, vivo. This is a term that was used in French scholarship too, survivance. So what do you think? Is his writing an early example of survivance?
Exactly.
About when was that term coined? Survivance.
Later. It's originally a legal term. And then French theorists picked it up. And no, Visitor is contemporary of ours. It's within the last 20 or 30 years. We're talking about it. Are these survivance stories that he's telling here?
Yeah.
I think he's advocating for survivance for certain. That's why I asked the kind of the time frame of the creation of the word, because I feel like when I read some of his passages here, I felt like if a W.E.B. Du Bois or Walnut, somebody like that would have been aware of these, they potentially could have leveraged them to try to get their message across, or at least kind of sort of copied the format a little bit, because it felt very like they could have done the same type of thing. It was just very articulate at it and did sort of what you defined. That's my opinion.
Well, he all but asked in here, what to the Native American is the 4th of July.
He practically said it, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that probably had an influence on how right. Give that famous speech until a decade later. So there was cross-pollination, I think, between the two movements. Somebody wanted to speak.
So what I was just going to say is that I think sometimes we have misunderstood people's ability to understand their situation and their circumstances and what they are able to hold on to in their inner space inside themselves. And I know from a Native perspective that there was always that understanding inside of yourself that you were not captured because the body does not hold. The body just holds some things that can go away, and there was a way to communicate that over and over and over again, so you'll know certain things. And I think when you live in an oppressive condition and society, then you have to have other ways that you're able to understand and communicate. And that is a cultural sense that I think W.B. Du Bois is talking about, as well as this writer. Understanding the nuances within the culture, because certain passages are read and understood so well culturally that it is a way that the predominant culture overlooks, because it doesn't understand actually the culture that was writing it and understanding it and the condition that they're in, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's why he's writing a book, or writing the these speeches because he wants to reimagine history, to look at it from a Native American perspective. And he's got to hold that mirror up and change things around. And in order to do that, he's got to make claims for Phillip. Might seem extravagant to us at first. You know, he's the greatest American who ever lived. He is a better general than George Washington. He's taking on the big myths of his day, the big heroes of his day, in order to instill a certain pride, to, again, turn the tables, to invert things and say, hey, wait a minute, this guy that people forgot Phillip were refined, you know, was the enemy. He was actually as good as good as or better than anybody white America has produced. And I think that's really important because then not just to set the historical record, to change that into effect for others. That's what he really was. A great example of the history connection. He's really trying to connect past and present here. And especially toward the end, to me, where he starts talking about how not just what's going on with the Cherokees, with other Native Americans, what's going on with him, day to day, the personal things, with other Methodists that he meets. And he's got those anecdotes toward the end, where he says, oh yeah, one Methodist allowed me to stay at his house, but he wouldn't give me a gun. He gave me some wood. He wouldn't let me sleep in a bed in his house because I was Native American. Another asked him to dine to put food behind the door. But he had to get it, you know, so the guy didn't really have to face him. And another said, without realizing he was Native American, because this guy dressed like this all the time. He dressed like a Boston gentleman.
Yes.
And he would startle people when, you know, an Indian's gonna speak, so they're expecting feathers, you know. And that's not what he gave. He gave them this. Hey, I can dress this like any of you and like any of you if I want to. And then he can go without realizing another Methodist says when these Native Americans need to be exterminated. He says, these things I mentioned to show that the doctrines of the Pilgrims had grown up with the people. In other words, the ideas are still here, the attitudes are still here. And it's not just the horrible things that are transported from their land, it's the day to day. Then he says, what do Indians want? They want what whites want in order to make men of them, good and wholesome citizens. And we talked at some point about just being seen as a person. Said, you know, people haven't invited me into their homes, or if they have, it's as a curiosity, not to see me as a person, as a fellow man, as a Christian, or all the things that he had. Even when they do, he says, it was only to satisfy curiosity and not to look upon me as a man and a Christian. To look upon me as a man. That goes back to what you were saying, boys and the veil and the mask, all of the difficulty to see across these racial barriers we've created. So what's the solution?
Is there a solution? I was gonna say, we're need to wrap up, so do we have the?
Yeah, tell us what his solution is.
Marry the connection and those unjust laws and Plymouth Rock together and become friends. Bury Plymouth Rock. So pretty strong statement to be making when Daniel Webster, a decade before, is making a speech about Plymouth Rock and how wonderful it was. And the Pilgrims are so great. The hatchet, and this is in Native American. And those unjust laws and Plymouth Rock together, and let's become friends. Pretty direct solution. See each other as people.
See each other as people.
So we should read this today so that we do that today? Yes?
That put your remark, you sit down, think that's why it's still.
There you
Exceptional as a win, there are still people around who are, including our new speaker in the house. Don't have to ride for this Angeles.
Yes.
Well, we're right back. Pilgrims here.
We are in the team, so.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, any concluding words from, Vicky, go ahead.
Oh, did you say Vicky? Oh, my sister, can you hear me? Yeah. My sister, before she died, lived in Connecticut, and she was very involved in trying to get the John Mason statue that's in a niche at the state capitol in Connecticut removed. I know in 2021 it was still there, and he, as you may know, John Mason was the one that led the 1637 massacre against the Pequot. And I'm wondering if you know if that statue has come down or what they've done with it.
Midwesterners.
We'll have to look and see.
Yeah.
We're at John Mason University.
George.
George. His brother. No, I just made that up.
They did melt down the Robert E. Lee statue, you know.
Yes.
Yeah.
Build it
In
in
private, secret.
All right. Any final words or concluding ideas?
Read The Invention of Thanksgiving by Phillip the Laureate. Was in the New Yorker, November 18th, 2019. You can find it online. It's a very informative essay about the whole Thanksgiving and the way it grew up. The laureate is Native American himself, the scholar. And so November 18th, 2019, in the New Yorker, The Invention of Thanksgiving. Did that.
Yeah, we talked about it one year, but we invite everyone to read on their own. And then our December discussion will take place on the first Wednesday of December. And it is on.
And we have, among other things, Bessie Davis's eulogy for Malcolm X, Martin Luther King's last speech, and then a couple of other readings. And my co-leader will be the poet laureate of Cincinnati, Haley Kumari.
All right. Well, thank you everyone online and thank everyone here. And for more information or updates on any of our programs and also on the restoration project, you can visit our website at stowhousecincy.com. All right. Thank you all for coming.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you.
Vanessa, we really appreciated that. We learned a lot from you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.